So if we've got turmoil and persistence, I think these two are not a duality, but more within a range, maybe the ending points of a wide range of whatever goes on in the world, be it in the beehive or on the streets. And of course, you always got persistence within turmoil, and you've got turmoil within persistence. So they need each other to a certain degree. And still, as you may realize, I don't feel very well with dualities. But as we know, language-wise, it's very hard to think in non-dualistic terms. I try it a bit because the persisting, in inverted commas, turmoil, or the turmoiling, in inverted commas, persistence, are both there, as I would say, and they are only, as I said before, fictional points within a wide range of processes and hybridities. So, which brings me to the point that what we listen to today is very important for popular music studies as well, because we have to deal with the positive and negative aspects of both turmoil and persistence. And as it is now persistence today, let me have a few words concerning what might be persistence in the end, because just if you look it up somewhere, and if you read stuff about persistence, my first impression was it's not coming from social sciences or cultural studies, where I'm coming from, or media studies. It's dealing more with viruses and the persistence of illness or viruses, which I find very interesting, so maybe a negative aspect of persistence. As well as I don't feel very comfortable with persistence. Persistence seems something like stuckedness, I would say. You know, the whole world is talking about mobility today, and I heard a very good presentation by Ghassan Hage from Pakistan, a scientist or scholar from social sciences, a very good presentation on stuckedness, just as a keyword. You know, everybody's thinking about mobility, flexibility, blah, 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 but most of the people are stuck. So the question might be, where are you stuck? I'm stuck here now, but I can do my very best especially with the guests, to get out of this. But just to remember you, persistence on the one hand can be very positive, like the German translation would suggest, but at the same time persistence can be conservative or even worse. And second, persistence, I would say, which persistence is dealt with, because it seems to be something like individual point of view compared to social points of view concerning persistence. For the one person, the biggest persistence, for example, I had today was getting a coffee in the hotel. Oh, yeah, that's great. And the train brought me here yesterday, second persistence. In time, no persistence in German train business. On the one hand, for other people, or like in the book we've all received from the CTM, texts are dealing with the big persistences, for example, in society, and the turmoil, of course, last year in society and not coffee-wise in a hotel. So, which we might talk about later in the discussion, might be the point of view, or how to differentiate, if you want to differentiate between these different kinds of existence, persistence, resistance, of course, all the terms that come to mind if you think a bit longer about persistence. But again, you end up with building up a kind of a theoretical framework within a wide range from the one side persistence to the other turmoil. And I would strengthen out as my last remark the possibility, the ability and the competences to analyze not only the extreme points of this range, but the mid. And I feel myself as someone, even politically, standing somewhere there in the mid, and at the moment really getting nervous because of all the extremes and the fundamentalists from all sides, not really arguing, but more screaming, if you think at the hate speech in the internet, for example. So what I would say as last intro words is, aren't we all a bit in the mid? Aren't we all a bit stuck maybe there? And aren't we all trans bodies or trans somethings, because we're coming back to this in a second. And this means for university programs or for research, I would say, and this is what I'm asking for since, I don't know, for about 20 years, to to develop something like transdisciplinarity and transperspectivity, which is not only keywords to get more money for the programs, because most people don't understand it, which is totally different to interdisciplinarity or interperspectivity, which is a first step, and then we go back into our offices, but we try it in Paderborn with economics, media, and music studies, really to combine it, and then it's still interdisciplinary, and then hopefully the students are something like trans bodies or transdisciplinary researchers, because then they can deal with the hybridities better than standing only on one side of the range. Which brings me to the first presentation, and I'm very happy to have 4 presentations, which, as I said, are not my cup of research, which is very, very inspiring to me. First presentation will now be by Alana Harris. Alana Harris is a researcher, is an artist and an organizer, so here we go with the trance. She's graduated from Harvard University did a BA, a Bachelor in Music, Cognition and Perception, and she's now pursuing research at Humboldt University, Berlin, concerning human-computer interaction. And there we go, she's proposing to study synesthesia as a pluralistic template for innovation and social action. So you're welcome, Ilana, with your presentation on ideasthesia.
Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for proposing such a festival with specific interest in connectivity and on this sort of transdisciplinarity or cross-disciplinarity that you just spoke about. So my presentation will be on ideasthesia. I hope you enjoy, and I will go into the inner workings of it within a text, not a PowerPoint, in order to kind of not, I don't know, encourage myself to kind of go off on these on these tangents that I so love. But yeah, anyways, I hope you enjoy. Nowadays especially, synesthesia can be somewhat of an ambiguous term. Initially introduced in Greek philosophy in relation to choia, or color, of music, the term synesthesia has recently become subject of neurosciences research and pop culture confessionals. Synesthesia's foundational definition, the uniting of the senses, is generally agreed upon, broken down by its formative Greek roots, syn meaning together, and aesthesis meaning sensation. It describes unification of the senses in terms of its overall symptomatic experience, as well as on a cross-sectional categorical level. In this talk, I will propose ideasthesia, an overarching view of synesthesia, as a framework for re-examining otherwise categorically segregated human experience. Whereas in neurobiology, synesthesia applies to an affective condition that pertains to abnormal individual experience, in anthropology it is described as a merging of senses that extends past core sensory stimuli response and involves the production and reception of human artifacts. Though its neurological condition refers to a multi-response, stimuli-triggered mechanism of low-level senses, synesthesia within the interdisciplinary context is comprehended as being synchronically unified, in which bridging of perception, action, and cognition's domains coalesce in holistic phenomenological experience. This widened conception of synesthesia gave rise to a novel term, ideasthesia. Ideasthesia was also birthed from the hearth of cognitive science, as initial studies suggesting synesthesia's founding in direct connectivity gave way to the suggestion that overarching concepts with unknown but more complex mechanisms of connectivity mediate these associations. This relationship presents in studies that utilize stimuli with ambiguous referentiality to elicit different perceptions across subjects. Due to pre-exposure to cross-modal linkages stemming from unique experiences, such as those presented in early childhood, individuals form their own complex conceptual webs, so as to understand the world around them. So what can the tension between synesthesia and ideesthesia reveal in terms of how we view multisensory perception as manifesting in the brain, or more concretely, in the individual? Since its first appearance in scientific literature, in writings by Dr. G.T.L. Sachs in 1812, synesthesia was soon came to be recognized as an unquestionably abnormal neurological phenomenon. While its exact neural correlates remain unresolved, proposed mechanisms of development involve increased crosstalk between specialized regions of the brain and disinhibited feedback inhibition. These theories of ontogeny closely parallel those relating to multisensory integration, a subset of human perception occurring in the general population. But what makes synesthetic sensation different from that which originates from one of the five senses? Why must those whose experiences diverge from the clear-cut lines of this sensorial pentagon be irreversibly deemed and abnormal? Perhaps synesthesia's abnormality is determined by its untenability, by slipping through the hinges of signal flow empiricism with its covariance in phenotypic and cerebrospatial manifestation. Or perhaps synesthesia causes particular frustration due to its seating at the very center of disciplinary distinction, namely, that which divides the subfields of the mind study across philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience, with the time-tested yet bond-straining mind-body problem coursing through its affective molecular mythology. We may concede that synesthesia and its derivative perceptual phenomena, while being correlated with enhanced cognitive abilities such as perfect pitch, multilinguality, and enhanced long-term memory, proves to be dangerously unstable in its shifting form amongst myriad isotopic configurations and unquantifiable units of measurement which evade definition by modern categorizational techniques. So what happens when synesthesia is so slippery that its ontology, meaning, and systematic categorization evades us? How do we cope with something that so glaringly goes against the precious boxes of networks that we so arduously, diligently, and devotedly crafted, yet those which, for this particular situation, prove to be utterly inadequate, unnecessary, and insufficient? Returning back to synesthesia's definition and the gratification of pattern seeking that we know and love so dearly, we look at the epidemiology of synesthetes, who they are, how old they are, and where they are situated. Perhaps through quantifying the inhabited identities of synesthesia, we can draw some meaning from its shimmering depths. Even before its mentioning in scientific writing, synesthesia appeared in autobiographical and descriptive texts regarding a variety of individuals' synesthetic experience, with a particular prevalence amongst those in the creative fields. Synesthetic accounts arose from Olivier Messiaen, who created his modes of limited transposition in order to render his own sound-color synesthesia, and Arthur Rimbaud, who boasted of being the inventor of Vowell's colors. Looking at the populations affected by synesthesia, we see an increased incidence in artists and musicians. 23% of fine arts students, as reported by the Creativity Research Journal in 1989, and within this subgroup of synesthetes, a score of 38.4 out of 40 on the Baron-Welsh art scale, a standardized creativity measure. As such, synesthesia may be employed not only in garnering holistic semantic experience from the totality of an environment, but also in illuminating meaning through self-generated cross-modal transduction. Today, creatives may take on any number of professional fields, not limited to those of art, music, poetry, and literature. Peppered throughout the socioeconomic strata, we live in a day and age where creativity, artistry, and hyperconnectivity are exceptionally beneficial when applied directly to human experience. Consider a situation where you are very hungry. You think of a pizza, the salty yet umami flavor of fermented dairy, the gooiness of the melty cheese in tandem with the crispy yet chewy crust. You imagine hearing tires grind upon the asphalt as your awaited treat makes its way from its heated ovens to your eagerly awaiting arms. And then it hits you. You must perform an action in order to instantiate this procedure, but the late hours and the inevitable intoxication makes this action utterly inconceivable. Luckily for you, many a like-minded person has in fact been in this very situation. And so too was this individual capable of conceptualizing the programming, design, marketing, and financial planning around creating a simplified press of an iPhone button application for this very service. Oh, come on, paper. Countless softwares, hardwares, and other miscellaneous products of consumption have been conceived by multi-conceptually astute startup entrepreneurs and their paternal free market. However, this cycle from experiential recognition to startup to monopoly may also feed back in the opposite direction and engage in its own process of quantization, experimentation, and replication. Reaching homeostasis once its countless simulations land upon the most effective model, its feedback loop inevitably cripples the very boundless curiosity which birthed it. While it may be tempting to cultivate this creativity cash crop, I invite you to consider an acceptance of the opposite, fostering an untamed Amazonian agriculture of the senses, an indefinite palette of colorful and textural adaptations, constantly shifting and iridescent, adding and subtracting, translating and transforming, wholly dynamic. Yet, as fostering a mini Amazonian biome in the moderate mid-Atlantic would be highly improbable, I am not suggesting that we create an isolated utopia and quarantine this creativity and its lush humidity in order to let it grow. Rather, I am putting forth an invitation to exercise restraint in our use of specialized scruples. Maybe building the perceptual skill set of a person who readily experiences the sight of a worm, along with its pinkness, wetness, and wiggliness, will allow us to better understand the soil, grass, and creatures around it. Maybe it will allow us to more feasibly exist alongside that environment. We must not forget our systems of inspection, such as those geographical, biological, and physical methodologies which we use to find, scrutinize, and theorize about the world in the first place. Likewise, we should cherish our ability to ascend the staircase of intellectual pursuit and inquiring knowledge through specialization. And likewise, be wary of envying the application developer, or chastise the physician who finds the next pharmacological cure upon returning late to the lab from his son's piano lesson, the next penicillin eating away at his staphylococci cultivated petri dish. More generally, if our methods of education and occupation invited interdisciplinarity as an overarching conceptual framework, rather than simply emerging of disciplines, we would, in fact, gain more use, insight, and joy out of the very people we are and the environment in which we are situated. And so, I leave you to re-examine my own argument for ideesthesia, urging us to newly grapple with pre-imposed boundaries as a proof of concept, a theoretical model, or a way of being. As an unstable molecule, unbeknownstly drifting between, but not limited to all of the above. As a sensation, a concept, or an experience. Thank you. Sorry for throwing all those neuro terms, by the way. I was like trying not to.
Any questions, remarks, comments? Any questions, remarks, comments? This one.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I think it's a very interesting concept, and what I didn't get really is this connection between your aesthetic approach and the physical, the physiology, the EEG, for example, because this is a very narrow way to get a perspective on feelings and body and perceptions, and how do you link these both methods?
So when you say this is a narrow way, are you speaking about EEG and kind of like neuroscientific measures?
Yeah, I mean, I speak of this of the physiological tradition, and actually the perspective on a body that came out in the 19th century that actually actually pursued a very mechanized perspective on our perception, and how you link this with it, because as far as I understood that this concept you presented here is really, like you said, an umbrella, is more like a fluid concept to cross borders and categories in our thinking about perception, right?
Yeah, so, wait. Oh, yeah, okay. So basically I'm introducing ideesthesia because I actually find it very interesting as a term, in that it came out of actually the Max Planck Institute in Frankfurt, focused on neuroscience, yet the term itself vehemently actually departs from neuroscience. In that kind of synesthetic explorations, neuroscientific explorations of synesthesia are very much in the direction that you mentioned of, trying to boil down where it is in the brain, and the exact sort of network that allows that process to occur. Whereas ideesthesia kind of says, okay, let's forget that. It's not about mapping, a signal through its flow or through its path in order to see how this behavior occurs. It is more so about looking at synesthesia not as, okay, point A to point B is occurring, but also point C to point D is occurring, but rather saying, okay, when we think of the color yellow, we also think of a lemon, we also smell a lemon, we also taste a lemon. We have this whole experience that simultaneously occurs and is all connected with our one concept of this particular experience. So my presentation is basically getting at exactly what you're speaking of, that all of these things actually are holistically connected. And though we can learn about kind of one of those specific pathways through neuroscience, it's important to remember about this holistic experience and actually to remain grounded in that through our specialized experimentation.
Thank you. Thank you. And
Thanks.
Maybe one more question. How do you link that? How do you connect that? Do you go by terms or by experience, or what's your method connecting these very different perspectives and scientific disciplines?
No, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I don't know, and that's what I was trying to kind of put in there with my little aim was like, okay, we need to, obviously keep developing our specialized measures, but to the same extent, be in conversation with other disciplines, get their viewpoint on the matter, maybe have those inform our own specialized techniques. So basically, I think what's really important is actually to have conversation amongst different perspectives around the same issue. So not as complicated as this whole ideesthesia explanation, and hopefully the linkage is somewhat clear after after that.
It's probably a bunch of disciplines. Yeah. Okay.
No,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay. Due to time, I would say, I mean, just one little comment, this is exactly what I would have asked, because I think we should develop or try to develop new theories and methods, not get stuck within the old ones. Old doesn't mean bad. So your presentation really made me curious now about new methods with this special field. Okay, thanks again, Ilana. And next presentation will be Pierre Depaz, is it right? Okay. Pierre is political scientist, which I find very interesting because I studied politics as well. Political scientist, software developer, educator and artist, so another trans body maybe. He exhibited in New York City, Paris, Cairo, Abu Dhabi, Brussels and Berlin. And he's currently research fellow at the Film University Konrad Wolf in Babelsberg here around the corner. He's programming as well, which might be a very interesting aspect concerning his research. His artistic and academic research, or maybe both in one, is on computers attempting to represent or interface with human concepts and emotions. And I'm really curious listening to your presentation on creative coding through Jacques Rancière's Politics of Aesthetics.
How do you say present in German? Präsentierung? Yeah. No. Mitteilnahme. I just moved here, so my German is not so good. But thank you. So, this is sort of the theoretical underpinnings of my research in software studies. And I come at it through the practice and thinking about creative coding. Creative code is, to some people, kind of an antonymic. I think to me there's an ambiguity that could be productive, that to some extent creativity requires constraints, and code in itself can be coded through processes that lead, like Fluxus has shown us, to the development of new experiences. And so the two definitions that I start with talking about creativity is one, the new and useful production of experiences, which I think is a good illustration, is sort of the political, economical aspect of creativity, in which you do something that is better than something before and that can be used by someone and is innovative. And there's sort of a resonance of management theory, of business studies, in that sense of creativity, of being able to measure it and being able to extract value as much as possible. But there's another one so this first one is by Michael Mumford, the second one is by Robert Sternberg, who talks about just the use and the devising of worthwhile experiences. And I think worthwhile is a lot more broad in that sense and allows us to sort of aim at, on the one side, at the economic and the political, and on the other side, that which is not economic and political, and the worthwhile could be pursued for itself. Like, nothing prevents self-determination in that sense. And when I was at a creative coding conference a couple of months ago, this ambiguity between the political, economical, and the artistic was really impressive to see. On the one side, you had people who were on a stage and who would say that I'm an artist and it's my personal practice, my artistic practice, and over. And then when you would talk to them and you would ask them what they do for a living, they say they were creative. So on the one side, they're using those tools in order to produce the super highly politicized, aestheticized effect of web development, web design, app design. And on the other side, they're using the same tools to pursue their own interest and their own artistic endeavors. And so this is Jacques Rancière. And Jacques Rancière works with the concept of, or works with many things, he works with the concept of consensus and dissensus. And I think that this concept is interesting to map on the previous opposition between political, economical use of creative coding and artistic use of creative coding. So he first talks about consensus and dissensus in his 10th thesis on politics, which is a lecture that he gave in 1985 at the Gramsci Institute. And he considers consensus as the delimitation of who can take part in what. what that means is that consensus is sort of what the police state allows us to do, allows us to see, allows us to hear and act upon. It's a broader part of his theory, which is the distribution of the sensible. And the sensible here is not what makes sense, what is intellectually intelligible, but what can be felt by the senses. And this is basically separating the space and configuring the space so that people, everyone in the space, has a particular place in that. So for example, like this stage is made where I am is for speaking, the chairs where you are is made for listening, and the chairs here are made for waiting, and they're all clearly defined in an aesthetic sense, in how we can interact with it with our bodies, with our voices, and with our sight. He comes at it with, from the perspective of the police state, and very much so influenced by his work with Althusser, his work on Marx, and his experience in the 1968 student protests in France. One of the examples he gives is that if the police stops you at some point on the road when you're driving, you stop, and the police immediately reconfigures that space into a space for punishment. It's no longer a space for moving. I do think that there's an interesting correlation to make with software and this distribution of the sensible, because now when we sort of follow Deleuze's thought about the control societies in which we are constantly muddled and modified by information fluxes, then the sensible is not just what we can hear, see, and act upon, but it's also what we know and what we don't know. This abstract space, and software is really good at that. Software is really good at defining what can be seen, what can be not seen. The work of Friedrich Kittler, who was at Humboldt University, has this idea of technician median, in which the technique defines what you can do and what you can say. You have a protected mode and you have an easy mode. You have the representation of software, and then you have the reality of hardware, in which what you can see here is not really software, it's just basically a little bit of electricity. And software is really good at that. In this example of the PowerPoint slide, there are two modes of aesthetic representation. There's the presentation mode and there's the edit mode, right? Which one is made for working, the other one is made for presenting, and you can't really interact with both. But since I can continue like that, it's easier. So software is really good at that, right? You have interfaces, you have applications, and you have sort of a virtuality of it. And the virtuality brings me to the first time that someone used the term virtual reality, which is Antonin Artaud, the stage theorist and dramaturge in the early 20th century, where he says that theater is where both the real and the virtual appear, and they conflate in one space. And this is what interests Rancière in the way that he sees art as reconfiguring spaces through shifting boundaries. What that means is that on one side you have consensus, right? On one side, you guys are here, I'm here, you're here, we're all separated. Dissensus, in which for him is true politics, is the reconfiguring of these boundaries and being able to say, well, I used to be excluded, now I'm included, even though I have no reason for being included. And so, it is the appearance of what has been hidden. And the appearance of what has been hidden is even more prescient for me in creative coding, in the sense that you can present all these interfaces, all these slick interfaces, but the point will be to hide the reality of it, the reality that there's no real software, the reality that you're interacting with a social system rather than with a screen of your iPhone. And that this interaction is going to be so nice, when you click on like on Twitter and you have a little heart that pops up, this sort of emotional, beautiful, sensible relationship prevents you from thinking about you're only able to like, you're not able to do anything else, right? You're not able to dislike, because we all live in a consensual space. So dissensus is the appearance of what has been hidden. For Rancière, it is something like making the private public, making what is domestic public. The idea of the people who have nothing can participate into the discussion of economy. The people who are not supposed to have a house can participate in a discussion of housing. And software, in the sense of creative coding, allows us to do that through, well, it's easier in presenter mode. Through multiple things. First, through not hiding anything that they're working with. when you go online, you see a lot of resources about how to do any sort of project that you've seen. You've seen like online discussions, forums, step-by-step tutorials, the really showing everything that is supposed to be hidden by the modern software industry, in which there's the presentation mode and the edit mode. And in creative coding, those two are collapsed together. They're able to participate in our public space. And I'd like to focus, to finish quickly, on interactivity. And interactivity is sort of this redistributing of the sensible. You have interactivity on one side where you click on the Twitter button and you have the little like, and then you feel good, and that's all. And you have interactivity as sort of a feminist practice, right? Like Margaret Morse talks about the poetics of interactivity as an inclusive gesture that is allowing you to be integrated into a system, not integrated as a hierarchical relationship in which you give a like and then that's all you get, but more in a discussion in which things like your fingers swiping on a screen, your silhouette moving in front of a camera, or your voice talking about a microphone is going to make something about this coded system react, and then integrate you as an equal and valid participant of that system. So in the end, this sort of this example of interaction is, to me, what I find the most interesting is the ambiguity of the creative use of computation. Because on one side, you have computation as like the tools of the master, right? You have the computation that checks on your phone, that checks on your data, that like if you work in a workplace where you have a digital card, maybe there's a bug, maybe you can't go anywhere in any room because your digital card doesn't work, it segregates the space like this. On the other side, it's also a sensible representation that allows you to switch places, right? You're no longer just a user or just a viewer, but you can also be someone who participates in an artwork, even though sometimes we might have been told that we should just go to a museum, sit and look at what, I don't know, Rembrandt has made. I lost my train of thought. Yes, sorry. So the trick is that I didn't actually find the presenter notes, so I didn't bring my notes, so I didn't have notes. But I think my time is up. So thank you for listening.
Questions? Any questions, remarks? Thank you very much, Pierre. Oh, sorry.
What happens when interconnectivity is limited so as not to be consensual?
Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, so if interconnectivity can only be exhibited within a certain number of actions or within a certain domain, what happens to the consensuality of it?
I'm not sure what you mean by interconnectivity. Interconnectivity between systems, between
or
humans and systems?
Or like interaction.
Interaction, okay.
Yeah.
I think the point is that it happens in a particular place or in a particular moment, right? Like if you're interacting on a system with Twitter, no one really, like when you're clicking I'm always taking the Twitter example because the heart animation is really nice. But when you're clicking that, Twitter doesn't really care about who you are, where you are, when you are, right? And so they're interacting with you not as a human being, but they're interacting with you as an abstract like user profile, like someone who exists in a database or someone who is modeled in like their design room. Whereas I would argue that even if it is limited in a particular place in a particular time, it is that particular place and that particular time that makes you worthwhile into entering that space and like creates a dissensus about what Twitter would like the world to be.
Any questions, remarks further?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I was a bit late, but I was curious, how does personal attachment to the tools you're using, platform you're using, actions you do play a role in this dissensus framework? For example, I'm thinking of distal attribution for tools. Like at some point, if I use a tool and it becomes part of me, it becomes more mindless action. So this framework of what's hidden and what's not hidden kind of shifts. So I'm wondering, like, if you thought about how people identify with their persona on Twitter or whatever other platforms you looked at, and how does that play a role in what's hidden and what's not? Thanks.
So I don't actually use Twitter. I just really I have a GIF of that heart somewhere, and I think it's a really nice example, but I tend to stay away a little bit from Twitter. And I don't look so much as platforms than at actual pieces of software, like PowerPoint or a particular application. I think my answer to that would be that when you use a tool, unless you have a very high technical level, you're always sort of subsumed by the worldview that the tool provides to you. And that this worldview is going to be made by the designer or builder of the tool, in this case Twitter or whoever else works at the UX or I don't know who who develops OpenOffice. But that whenever you start having this technical skill to change that tool, you're making another tool. And so I do believe that emotionally it's impossible to get rid of this attachment. The maybe pessimistic answer is that it's the relationship of the people in power, it's the responsibility of the people in power to change it, rather than our responsibility. And when I mean people in power, it's people like open source software, OpenOffice, that provides it to us, right? Which means maybe not putting yourself as a template on PowerPoint, which is first and foremost a business software, and maybe not the most apt thing to use for an academic presentation. But
just one short question, who's the police?
Who's the police? I think, at the time, I think in '68, the police was the police. I think now, it would be the different people who teach classes in software engineering across computer science departments. The moment where you tell people that it's okay to have an abstraction for other people, and not, it's useful to have an abstraction because you can count how many people here and then you have enough chairs, right? But not be critical about this and have such an impact on the world. I think that it's the moment in I guess as an educator, I think it's educators' responsibility. But I think it starts, this police starts in the developers themselves. And then the marketers and the CEOs just actually build on that knowledge and that power.
Okay, thank you again, Pierre, for your nice presentation. Oh my God, feeling like a mainstream researcher, now a policeman. This is a transmission. Anyway, next presentation will be by Alejandra Cardenas. She is based in Berlin as a researcher and a self-taught musician. And she studied art history at the University of San Marcos in Peru and did her MA or Master in Sound Studies at the University of the Arts in Berlin. The thesis was on data sonification and cognition. Alejandra currently is practicing her Master in History and Culture of Science and Technology at the Technical University of Berlin. She composes experimental electronic music for films, dance, theater, as alias Ale Hop, is it pronounced rightly? Okay. And she's now dealing with changing soundscapes and in our daily life, and which I find very interesting, again, the competence of hearing or the sociology of hearing, and she's coming from, or she's having a wide range from the church bell to the smartphone, which makes me really curious again. So, Alejandra, you're welcome with your presentation on data soundscapes, action-based sound, and cognitive capitalism.
Thank you. Where is the button? Everything's in German. This one? Preview?
No, so you're in preview, I think.
Ah. please. How did you open it?
Oh, it is a PDF.
Well,
Yeah.
okay, this is the best.
Let's see, maybe here.
Well, that's a little bit better. Thank you. I want to begin by raising the question around how the amount of sounds that we hear from our smart devices, and I made a list. Just today I wrote this text. It began in the morning with the clock alarm ring to wake up, and then the arrival of the first set of messages in the morning, the emails and spams and offers and newsletters, invitations and more spam and more newsletter and more offers. And through the day, the different sound notifications that indicate the status of every app on a smartphone, receive SMS, WhatsApp chats, newsfeed updates, the software update alarm reminder, the calendar reminder, the weather report, Google Maps traffic advice, a love match, a Facebook memory, a new story on Instagram. Someone started a live video, a stranger is following you, a mention, a tweet, a new Wi-Fi network found, an upcoming event, a shared file, a new music release, the low battery warning, etc. So by looking at reports of average sound notification that we receive every day, I found that many users interact with their smartphone devices more than 100 times a day, and this report is from 2017, so more than 1 year ago. And yeah, digital devices sending sounding notifications to their users have become ubiquitous. We recognize them unconsciously and deal with this notification effortless, but without missing a beat. And this orchestra of data is built in our own lives, framing our bodies, flowing naturally. So data is embodied not only in our smartphones and computers, but hardwired into everyday practices like moving, working, communicating, watching movies, listening to music, etc. So notification, alerts, alarms, warning rings, bells, they all correspond to the category of event-based sonification. And by sonification, I mean to map non-sonic data parameters into audible sound, basically to encode information through sound. And they mark the initiation, reminder, or change of an event, or carry information as a binary signal. That is conveying presence or absence, acceptance or denial, on and off, follow or unfollow, yes or no. Moreover, warning notification sounds can carry a particular urgency. Other sounds afford an action. For example, the clock alarm that affords to wake up, or the phone ringtone that affords spoken communication. Mostly sonification in smart mode devices are action-oriented, or meant to support the interaction of task-related process, to enhance action. Emission of alarm signals for the function of communicating are also common among animals. Some of them have a complex warning language and use different alarm codes, various types of simple 1-bit binary signals to warn the members of their species and other species of the presence of predators or danger, but also less threatening purposes like sex identification, territorial boundaries, or social signaling to reveal hierarchical status. In such chaotic landscapes, more processes are hidden and are only accessible to human senses through user-friendly and transparent graphic and auditory interfaces. According to Anderson and Polt, that, quote, blends smoothly into our homes and environments as something we do not have to deal with consciously, end of quote. But how does the interface accomplish this to be transparent? As Galloway pointed out in his book, The Interface Effect, technology hides their own functioning in order to become more intuitive and render the invisible into tangible while making the visible device invisible. To better understand the context in which this transparency rises, I want to connect the idea around Byung-Chul Han's critique of neoliberalism in his book, an essay, Psychopolic Neoliberalism and New Technologies of Power, in which he claims that transparency is subtle and smart because the neoliberal regime's technology uses it to escape all visibility. And by being invisible, it allows domination to remain entirely hidden and a subject to be unconscious of his own exploitation. In this sense, emotional design's aim is to activate and optimize for the sake of consumption. Quote, emotions are steered in by the limbic system, which is also where the drives are seated. They form the pre-reflexive, half-conscious, physic and sexual level of action that escapes full awareness. Neoliberal psychopolitics seizes on emotion in order to influence actions on this pre-reflexive level. So, smart power does not impose nor repress, argues Hunt, rather appeals to all positive emotions and exploit them. Smart power invokes us constantly to participate in his immaterial mode of production by sharing our neat opinions, preference, and fulfilling and pleasing our wishes. Muriel Schaffer, one of the earliest researchers to bring awareness into environmental sounds, asked himself in his book, The Soundscape, is the soundscape of the world an indeterminate composition over which we have no control, or are we its composers and performers? But in this sonification realm, it doesn't seem to be our composition. It's rather orchestrated by this immaterial force that feeds on the sound of high-speed information. The high density of the modern soundscape has spread its noise pollution into every corner of our lives. Noise pollution are the sounds we have learned to ignore, adverts Schaffer. He categorized the main themes of a soundscape, by distinguishing between a keynote, sound signals, and sound marks. So, as you know, in music, a keynote is the note that identifies a key composition. Likewise, in soundscape, it will be the ground tonality of the place. For example, if you are in the countryside or the nature, it will be the birds or the wind. But if you are in the city, it can be the traffic sound. So, keynote sounds may not always be heard consciously. The fact that they are ubiquitously there suggests the possibility of a deep and pervasive influence on our behaviors and moods, explains Schaffer. Contrary to the signals, there are foreground sounds that are listened to consciously. The dilemma in the current spectrum of sound is that we don't deal with most of these sonifications in full awareness, not only because of its overflow or that they mainly convey meaningless information, for example, somebody is following you, but also because they intentionally operate on the peripheries of our perception, becoming a part of the ubiquitous keynote of digital communication. According to Barry Truax, quote, once the noise of modern technology becomes an habit, it is ready for the exploitation by the media. The power of long-term subconscious association can be tapped for commercial ends through frequent keynote-like repetition. End of quote. A general characteristic of cognitive processing that seems to lie at the basis of listening is the detection of difference. So in the habituation to a constant pattern, the repetition becomes redundant and the information becomes predictable. So because cognitive process is meant to detect variations, sounds become a background noise. For Schaffer, the most salient sound in the medieval European city was the church bell, because it was the center of the signal of the Christian community. It defines the community because the parish is an acoustic space circumscribed by the range of the church bell. And outside this parish, we find the wilderness. The church bell is the centripetal sound. It attracts and unifies the community in a social sense, just as it draws man and God together. Han pointed out that the devotional object of our era is the smartphone. According to him, it was like a modern rosary. Both the smartphone and the rosary serve the purpose of self-monitoring and control. Nowadays, thus, the smartphone notification sound fulfills a similar social function as the church, but its sound does not try to affect us in the same way that the bell did, with its metallic loudness emerging out of the presence of the church building that rose as a urban nucleus and social center of the city. Instead, in a time where cities are disconnected from their production reality, it is a short, discrete, user-friendly smartphone alarm that resonates in a highly networked immaterial existence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alejandra. Any questions, remarks?
Thanks for the presentation, thank you. I want to know if you are using these elements of data-driven soundscapes in your experimental music work, and how do you perhaps use this? Is it something that you use, perhaps?
No, not really. I do kind of noise music. Yeah, no, not at all.
Oh, cool. Oh.
Thank you so much. I was wondering, why did you choose to research this? Is there like a personal experience, or like, I don't know if you could share a little bit what was your, pathway to come to this research project?
Yeah, of course. I wanted to, for my master thesis, I want to write something about aesthetics on sonification, and I began reading this book that is the main book on sonification. I think is the Handbook of Sonification. And what it began to bother me about how the examples of the book, they seem to be fixated on the idea of designing sound in a very transparent and user-friendly way. And I think it's necessary also to pay attention on how these devices are designed, because it seems that they are contributing to this deficit attention that we have nowadays. And I think if sound designers and also interface designers think about these subjects and design objects that won't affect our attention, that will be like a good thing.
Hi. I really like the analogy of the smartphone and the rosary beads, and I wondered, we think about that from a morality point of view, and I wondered if you could add a credit card to that as a sort of a holy trinity of control.
Yeah, that would be perfect, actually.
Yeah, just a short remark. Maybe we can talk about in the general discussion later on. I find the aspect of smartness very interesting. We're talking a lot about smartness now today, smart dictatorship, smartphone, etc. So maybe we can come back to this, because I think it's what makes life hard. Yeah, to build up something, like you said, a special awareness for smart strategies, not being smart in the end at all. Okay, thanks again, Alejandra Cardenas, and now it's Gary Charles. Thanks, Alejandra, sorry. is an interdisciplinary artist, educator, researcher, and working with sound simulation and spatial politics. He's currently doing his PhD thesis at the University of Birmingham in the UK, and his work includes music composition and production. Gary's got a master in composition and sonic art at Oxford Brookes, and he's been working at Source Art Research Unit there. He was an associate practitioner, as it was mentioned. Gary's recent curatorial project was called Scenes from a Chasm in New York, and he's really working on something like a thesis on the cancellation of the future, as we know from Marc Fisher, as disappearing of arts through instant recalls, and dealing a lot with approaches, possibilities of resilient and offensive strategies to something like machine learning. I'm really curious listening to your paper on decomposing infinity in flat cultural times.
Thanks. Wow, thanks. You nearly did my whole talk for me. So my research looks at machine learning and simulation technologies as they are present in cultural production. My questions center around the implications that flow from these technologies that are developing. In this particular chapter, I ask whether there are any forms or approaches to music that are more resilient to simulation, and how these can be expressed through a creative practice. I hesitate to use the term artificial intelligence because of all the hype that surrounds it. However, within the context of my research, it's pretty hard to avoid. Elisa Yudkowsky, an AI researcher, I think summed it up well by saying, by far the greatest danger of artificial intelligence is that people conclude too early that they understand it. And I think that's something to keep in mind as I go through all of this. This is also supported by the work of Kate Crawford and Meredith Whitaker of the AI Now Institute. They look at cultural biases, ecological concerns, governance, all within this much hyped arena of research. They note that the beginnings of AI research were devoutly interdisciplinary, but over time this has narrowed to become a technical discipline. They recommend a rebroadening of that scope, and it is against that backdrop under which I undertake my research. Theorist Marc Fisher talks about a flattening of cultural time, an inability to produce seismic cultural shifts, or to imagine radical new futures. He uses examples from literature and film, but it's within music cultures that he finds the most compelling examples. Even within the supposedly forward or future-facing world of electronic music. For Fisher, we are locked in a loop of repetition, with only minor incremental cultural shifts over time. At the same time, we've witnessed rapid developments within the infrastructures that surround music, in the technology, distribution, in the financial and capital structures. This creates an illusion, or the illusion of advancement and change, yet in a cultural sense, Fisher sees time as stalling and thinning, with an overarching sense that everything has been done before. To give an example that I think illustrates this point quite well, I teach an undergrad music technology and sound art course, and one of the first things we do each session, or each course, is listen to Silver Apples of the Moon by Morton Subotnick. Almost without fail, the students will describe the music as futuristic. So here in 2019, we can refer to something that was composed over 50 years ago as From a Time to Come. Future, then, has less to do with time and more to do with the style or aesthetic. And I think this really illustrates Fisher's idea that we're trapped in a sort of unchanging cultural present with an absenting of futures. Hito Stahl also talks about absenting within cultural production, Her approaches focus more on the space side of the time-space continuum. It is space that is diminished, privatized and gated, with art spaces ring-fenced and cultural artifacts absented into tax-efficient vaults of late neoliberal capitalism. However, we have unprecedented access to the entire archive of these artifacts, or at least to representations of them, through digital imagery, streaming audio and video. This helps drive the thinning of time even further, allowing us to re-experience almost anything from our cultural pasts on demand, creating a sort of equidistance of all temporalities. My research then attempts to expand on this notion of thinning time by adding machine learning technologies to the mix and imagining what that might do. The notion itself of a music AI is problematic from the outset. Even if you just ask the question of what goes into a training set, it becomes very difficult. Is it popular music, classical music, regional music? Is it only canonical Western composers, predominantly male and white? Are all types and pieces of music of equal value? Do we have to privilege or uprank certain pieces? And how do we do that? Is it by reputation, sales, radio play? Do we even only include recorded music? What about improvised or performed music? How do we go about including ancient musics? What even classifies as music in the first place? So even just looking at the training set selection raises a mind-bending array of questions, and that's before we've even looked at the algorithm itself. So for these reasons, researchers and artists have tended to focus on more restricted sets. Recent examples include Depaz, Holly Herndon's Spawn project, and Actress and Young Paint, all trained on a tightly defined set or even single artist. However, even with such a narrow focus, we risk absenting the process elements of creation. So the impulsive doodles, lost improvisations, 32-bar chunks of forgotten loops on hard drives, a multitude of discarded takes, all absent from the machine's gaze. These are processes that have been deleted from the model, but were vital in the original human creation process. So when faced with all of these complexities, we might even question this entire endeavor. But let's assume that we keep going and we develop a near-perfect music AI. All social and cultural biases have been minimized. Our system has been trained on a data set of music so wide and varied that we feel it sort of represents all music. This point of time could even be seen as a kind of musical singularity. Going forward from then, our machine can generate infinite streams of multiple, acceptable, plausible music. Now, going back to Fisher's analogy, we have, at this point, essentially stalled cultural time. All that can be defined as music as we know it is embedded in the code, perpetually replenishing and replacing. However, something even then remains absent. It's the elements of music that are not described by notes, rhythm, scale. It is the alternative timeline, not the timeline that defines what we hear through the linear passing of events, but rather a timeline that is fuzzy and composed of cultural associations embedded in both individual and collective cultural memories. These connective cultures are difficult to model, and these seem to provide the contours or the outcrops on this flat time. In my research, I've asked whether there are similar pockets of resistance when looking at only the strictly formal qualities of music. Current machine learning approaches focus on notation, melody, tempo, rhythm, and are primarily within instrumental music, creating probabilities of musical events. This reveals the kind of music that we're more likely to be able to simulate, Western classical music, for example, is typically instrumental, is notated or already essentially coded. It's composed for a limited set and well understood set of instruments. This makes it quite suited to algorithmic analysis, hence Deep Bach being an early example. This led me to wonder and to hypothesize forms or approaches that might be considered resistant to simulation. My methodology is to incorporate these hypothesized resistance forms into a creative practice, creating uncontrollable systems that privilege these forms. Unfortunately, I don't have time here to go into very specific examples of each, but what I find are they're primarily based in popular cultures and subcultures, or what co-organised calls Afrocentric music, rather than the Eurocentric music typically emanating from the academy. I'd be happy to discuss some of these outside of the session, and the list and categories are still evolving as I go through my research project. But the way that I have them at the moment are categorized as follows: micro-regional cultures, perpetual movement, attitude-focused performance, improvisation and non-repeatability, incidental sound, spatial manipulation, and conceptual underpin. And within each of those categories, I've been working through some examples and then applying it to my own practice. And I guess the aim of all this, by privileging some of these resistance forms into a creative practice, is hopefully to expose some of the other outcrops that we might be able to find in our flat cultural time.
Thank you, Gary. Questions?
Hey, thanks for the talk. It was really inspiring. Had some thoughts about it, and wanted to ask if, what about the idea of intentionality? If you see that as a major point where you can
within music creation, or within a machine learning music environment creation?
Like in both, if that makes the difference between both.
So I think intentionality within my list of resistant forms, I speak about conceptual underpinning, or an aboutness within music, and that sort of implies a lot of underlying cultural connections, and so I think within that framework, intentionality certainly comes into play. So if you are creating something that is conceptually based, it's much more difficult, that is not, doesn't foreground musical, what we consider formula music forms, then it certainly would tend to be more resistant in terms of the way I've approached it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, another question would be about the resistance, the aspect of resistance, because I think resistance to me sounds a lot like the human's gonna be replaced in making music, to put that really simple. And it made me think of something I came across like a few days ago. That was when drum machines came up. There was kind of like a union for drummers in the UK, I think, and they were trying to resist against this, which is totally absurd if you think of it now, as far as drum machines have have come, like, and how they shaped our musical culture. So, yeah, that made me think of if there's like a parallel to music and AI.
So, I mean, I think definitely. Normally when we speak about automation and AI, speaking more broadly, not just in music, most of the headlines are usually what happens to jobs. And I think as musicians, you hardly even participate in that economy anyway. So I think it's kind of a false notion, because that same sort of, call it business ontology, that this is what we're doing with artificial intelligence. We're identifying a problem, or we're identifying something that can be made more efficient, kind of doesn't really apply, I don't think, to music entirely. However, for music entering that call it the marketplace, there is certainly a case for it. So there are, for example, startups who have raised funding and are trying to sell AI-based music as fodder for advertising, music soundtrack, whatever. So or Muzak, if you want to call it that, so it certainly is the intention of some practitioners to do that, to replace musicians. But for artists who are using these, they're using them as an experimental tool, and really to try and discover something about their own practice that may lead to something interesting. So I think there's a big distinction between those two sets of uses of these technologies. And I think the problem with the training set still, as soon as you widen out of one artist or a small group of artists, your kind of cultural and political sort of bias nightmare scenarios very quickly come into play, I would say.
And then we have a coffee break. So did you say, Gary, did you say business hauntology?
Yes.
I like that one.
Thank you, Gary, for your talk. You named some models that are resistant or more resistant to simulation. For example, improvisation. And what do you think about George Lewis and his system to improvise with machines?
So I think one of the, so in terms of my own creative practice, I'm taking pieces of software that are being advertised as AI. I mean, that firstly is quite a challenging claim. As was said at the beginning, we don't even know what it is yet. However, so I've found it quite interesting that those are entering the world as a marketing tool, and so I'm kind of trying to use those to play against each other. So I think the drum machine example is a really good example of that as well. It's a machine that was designed to perform a function, however, with a improvisational mindset of play rather than musicality, then you have a situation that I would argue is very difficult for another machine to come and replicate and model. They would then have to try and code in not only the machine, but methods of interaction that are possible.
Yeah, and I think just as a comment that one of the most resistant things to simulation is not maybe the music production or creation, but the social processes around music. And for me, this is not separable at all.
So,
because like the music, the listening to music, dancing to music, connecting via music, and all that, and this is not. There's no way to simulate this in a way, and this will always be resistant.
Yeah, so in my first sort of example, before I went on to the formal, that's kind of, that seems to be almost impossible to simulate without going and re-simulating the entirety of human history. And then you very quickly enter philosophical sort of debate. The example that I like to use there is that when I hear a guy called Gerald's Voodoo Ray, you know, for me, I don't necessarily think about the music in purely the music sense. It conjures all sorts of connections for me. Hacienda, an 808, Thatcher's Britain, the Repetitive Beats Act, and even though I never owned an 808, I never went to the Hacienda, and I wasn't living in Thatcher's Britain at the time. And so those connections that we have over time with music and that interact with each other amongst both individuals and collective memories, that is the ultimate resistant form, I think.
Thank
you. Speaking about human-centric point of views, there has been always like fear of every new piece of technology when we speak about music. So if we're projecting that on the current status of AI and the fear of AI, that it's going to bite us or whatever. So how you are dealing with such criticism related to music and the practice of AI or machine learning, and how you are dealing with such fear?
I don't think that I have fear in the music sense. Interestingly, with all of these questions, I think often we go back to the first session, and you know, kind of the most compelling argument for, or I find the most compelling arguments are to do less of everything. So there's a brilliant paper by Kate Crawford and Vlad Joler where they look at the anatomy of an Amazon Alexa and the extractivist cost of getting those. We were kind of promised a paperless society that was more ecologically friendly. However, we now have sort of a graveyard of rare earth metals that we can't put back. So I think that when I'm thinking of all of this, kind of the strongest arguments are usually to do that we should try and encourage doing less. So which is why when you kind of present the hardest question for me to answer when I speak about music with artificial intelligence is why bother at all? And I don't really know how to overcome that, because, and I guess that's why my research project has kind of quickly turned from building something to a cultural criticism, which I think is interesting, and I don't know if that trend will continue, but yeah.
Yeah, but from like a statical or a formalist point of view, do you see that it could like offer new opportunities and we should embrace it, or we should like just close the door? And I don't know. I think the same happened with the 808 as an example. Yeah.
I think neither and both. My personal view is that I think that it may be a disappointment. But we're going to, I mean, these technologies are evolving, so artists always want to use any new tools that are creating, but it does add to this overflow of artifacts. So whether we're thinking of visual images on Instagram. I mean, I don't know if you've seen some of the images that are developed through GAN networks. And to be honest, I find them fantastic to look at. So, but it does kind of make, when you think about it in this framework of collapsing time, because those networks have been fed what exists up until now, then it kind of has the ability, if we rely too heavily on them or see them as only a good thing, then it kind of has potential, I think, to stop time in the cultural, visual culture sense.
We will go on at 4:45 with the. There's another question, or maybe you can do it in the coffee break. I think we have to stop now or ask. Okay.
I was just wondering if you. Hello.
Hi.
Hi. If you think that artificial intelligence is already close to, let's say, typical musical processes like creativity, improvisation, and composing, you think that AI is already able to deal with that, basically? Or is it just still tools from creative people, from improvising people, like a normal instrument, like, let's say, a piano or a computer or whatever?
So I don't think that AI is well, it definitively isn't anywhere near replicating music as a general concept. However, if you look in little spots, I mean, humans, we've been doing this for, so if you think of music, it's, session musicians brought together to create non-offensive, passable music. And the humans involved in, so we've almost been trained to replicate in one ear just what's happened in the past, and the capital output that we've received for that has just, over time collapsed. So in that world of where there's a market for inoffensive music, then that has already existed in the human realm. And I would suggest that that would be, if AI does get to the point where it cannibalizes jobs, or that's the area that is probably more fearful, not only with the creation of the music, but also with things like playlisting and curation. So those may be the first to go, but I don't think that it's, for the reasons we've spoken about, that it is anywhere near actually replicating music. In fact, I don't even think that's a kind of question to consider, because it's more whether the additional flow of music that is created. So already Fisher was talking about what we do as humans, so more access to not only the history of music, but more access to the democratization of making music, which I think is fantastic, but it has ended up in this ability to just drop into any spaces of time. And any additional flow to that created through these technologies, I think only adds to that flattening of time. And I don't like to think of it as a bad thing or a good thing. I just think it's something to consider when we think about how our cultures evolve in music, art, literature, everything.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to continue at 3:45, and thanks again, Ilana, Alejandra, Pierre, and Gary. Thank you.
Thanks.